Hello, David.
Hello, everybody. How's everybody doing?
Hello.
Give me one moment. I'm just getting everything set up.
Okay.
Look at this. You can see all our friends. I'm gonna put myself on camera really quick. Hi, everyone.
Hi. Hello.
Wait, where am I? Oh, I'm in outer with
You're in outer
Cynthia.
space. Okay.
Me and Cynthia are out of this world.
Hello,
Get it?
Cynthia. It's me.
You know, I couldn't get it on my iPad. I had to do it on my phone.
Uh-oh.
Who's this, Ann?
Yeah.
Ann.
Am I the only one on camera right now?
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm not on camera because I'm not on my Zoom.
I'm on Zoom.
Hi.
Yes. I couldn't get onto Zoom on my phone, on my iPad.
All right. Do you see me?
Oh yeah, I see you,
I
Mary.
don't see anybody.
Okay.
Mary,
You.
Fran.
Hello.
Yeah.
Hello.
Yeah. Yes.
We're waiting for
That's
Professor Peritz to come on. Hello, Cynthia.
But why can't I get onto Zoom?
I don't know. Did you
David came
put
on.
in?
He's busy logging on.
I entered the meeting ID and the password, and I didn't get on.
And on your iPad, don't you have email?
On my iPad, yes.
Don't you have email?
And
I have email, yeah.
Go to email and see Susan's email and hit the
Oh, 1 minute.
And now we're live again, and it is good to be with all of you again. This is our third week in which we're doing a lecture series on inequality rising. And I'm very much looking forward to the day I get to see you in person. But until that day is safe, and I think we need to remember to be patient, that in a sense, the worst thing would be for us to let the cat back out of the bag, to come out too early and to start circulating the virus again or exposing ourselves to the virus. So we have to continue to be safe for a while. And one of the things I'm doing to feel connected, to maintain some sense of stimulation, is taking these lectures online while we can't do them in person. And so we are in the middle of a lecture series on the rise of inequality in the United States and other places in the world over the last 40 or 50 years. And I've given you a couple of lectures on this topic already. I want to just refresh your memory where we are. We've talked about why we should be talking about inequality during a pandemic. And that is because, in a sense, the virus is not spreading evenly or fairly in our society. It is spreading unevenly. And as we've seen with the data on zip codes and race and income and health insurance, there are a lot of people who are able to safely and effectively protect themselves from the virus. They tend to be wealthy. They tend to be white. They tend to have a certain level of education, a certain kind of access to healthcare. And then there are other people who are not able to protect themselves as well. And they tend to be poorer. They tend to have less in savings. They tend to need to go to work and to work in places where they're more likely to be exposed to the virus. There's an obvious racial demographic with it, with African Americans suffering fatalities at 3 times their rate in the population in some states. We should know, I think today, by the way, happy May Day, everyone, if that's something you mark. Today's May 1st, and so the data from April about the fatalities and the racial demographics of them may be coming out soon. The second thing we've looked at in detail together is what the coronavirus pandemic I'm sorry. I'm reading the wrong line. The inequalities of wealth and health in America before the pandemic of 2020. And I just want to spend a minute or two reviewing some of the most, I think, important data on this. This is about income increases from 1980 to 2020, and it shows you that the bottom 50% have seen their income increase at only about a third of the rate of economic growth, whereas the top 0.1% have seen their income increase, 0.01%, at 5-6 times the rate of economic growth. And so there's something unfair going on in the American economy. I've coined I think, funny way to refer to this, and funny, not so funny. The bottom 50% are increasingly referred to in the sociological literature as the Precariat, right? And so this is playing on Marx's idea of the proletariat, the people who own nothing. The Precariat are the people whose economic lives are precarious, who have maybe less than $400 in savings. And that is essentially the bottom 50% of the American population, or who are often in a position of trying to decide which bill they're gonna pay. Is it the health insurance bill, or is it the rent, or is it the child's education bill, or is it the car repair? They can't do all at the same time, even though they're all essential. Now, the top 0.01%, I've recently heard referred to as the Precariat, right? And so the idea here is that these are people who own pied chairs in wealthy cities throughout the world, right? And so we've got the Precariat and the Precariat emerging from our economy, the economically vulnerable and the hyper wealthy. And another way of looking at this, which I've shared with you before, is that when you compare groups at one time, instead of changes in groups across time, in the 60s and 70s, all of the economic groups were really quite tightly clustered together, not a lot of inequality. And in the last 20 years, the differences have been yawning. They're just huge differences between the bottom and the top, between the groups that you compare yourself with, right? I pointed out to you that not only have we become much more unequal, but we've also lost most of our economic mobility. If you're born in the bottom, you're likely to stay there. If you're born at the top, you're likely to stay there. Not very many people at all move from the bottom to the top or from the top to the bottom. Now, I tried to explain this to you, and one of the things we looked at is the fact that wages are making up less and less of the share of the overall economy. More and more of the profit that's made in our society goes out in forms of return on investment, not wages to workers. That unionization is way down. That taxation is much less progressive than it used to be. And so that's a fair bit of what's going on. But I do want to share with you a little bit more information. Please give me a moment while I get a different set of slides open for you. It's going to take me just a minute to do this. All right. Now let me go back to this other set of slides for you. Oops, sorry. Like I say, I'm still kind of finding my way around this technology. So here we go. So in addition to the factors that I've already shown you, I want to share, oh my goodness, I'm really, oh, here it is. Okay, good. A little bit more information about what's going on in the global economy that's generating the inequality. And the information I want to share with you now concerns two further developments that I referred to in our last lecture, but that I didn't have adequate information on. I went out and got that information. One of them concerns globalization. And this is a phrase that's used a lot in a lot of different ways. I want to refer specifically to the idea that American workers are increasingly put in competition with workers around the world. And so what this diagram on the left side of your screen shows is the extent of imports coming into the United States starting in 1973, when it was roughly 4% of the overall GDP of the United States, and that in 2011 it had essentially tripled to almost 12%, and that most of the growth in imports into the US economy has come from less developed countries. Now, this is the flip side of something we've talked about, which is that a lot of the goods in our economy have become more affordable, especially the goods that can be susceptible to import substitution, right? That is to say, we're no longer making them in our own country, whether we're talking about phones or televisions or cars or computers, those toys, clothes, etc. Those things are increasingly being imported, and they're being imported from less developed countries. And as you can see, the next diagram shows, and it's a little complicated to make out, but I'll explain it to you quickly. On the one hand, how exposed is an industry to imports? And as you go out on this line, they're more exposed, and you've got non-manufacturing as a blue dot and manufacturing as a yellow triangle. And on the other hand, what's happening to the wages in that industry? And what you can see is, if you extrapolate out, that especially in manufacturing, they're more exposed to imports, more competition from imports, and the wages have been going down 10%, 20% in some cases over the last 20 years, right? And that's a direct correlation between exposure to imports and decreases in wages. And then that reflects the fact that we have more and more imports, and more of those imports are coming from countries where wages are cheaper, and American workers are essentially competing with workers from other countries. Now, the other factor I want to point to here quickly as driving inequality in the United States is the growth of automation. I've talked with you a little bit about this before. I pointed out to you that in the 1960s, when Ford was making a car, there were roughly 60 workers on the assembly line to put that car together. Today, it's between 6 and 10. So essentially, the workforce has been cut into 1/10 of what it used to be. And what this diagram shows is that manufacturing output in the United States from 1973 to 2015 has actually gone up substantially, right? The value used to be around $2.5 trillion, and now it's over $5.5 trillion. So it's more than doubled. And yet the number of people employed has gone down, right? From around 20 million to around 12 million. So a cut of about 40%. So we're producing more than twice as many goods while employing fewer workers. And again, when we're talking about where inequality comes from, it's a complicated story. It's hard to know exactly how much blame do we assign to the fact that our taxes are much less progressive than they used to be. How much do we assign to the fact that unionization has gone down? How much do we assign to automation? How much do we assign to globalization? How much do we assign to a shift in power between labor and capital, which results in less of the profits of industry going out in terms of wages, more of it being paid in terms of dividends and return on investment? But all of those factors seem to be at play, and the result is that we live in an increasingly unequal society. So that's where we left off. And I now want to start talking about what the coronavirus is doing to the economy now. And here I am going to have to be somewhat speculative because we don't really know what the long-term effects are going to be. We know what the short-term effects are. They're devastating. And my data is not fully up to date, but that's because the data is changing so quickly. But let me show you a little bit of the snapshot of the present and then speculate a little bit about what may happen in the future. And so this is what's happening with retail sales. And I think you can see, right, no previous recession, and I don't have the data to compare it with the Great Depression. And note that this takes into account March. We don't have the data for April yet, but I'd be willing to bet you that April is going to dwarf March in terms of the decline of retail and food service sales in the United States. No, even the Great Depression was less than half as bad as the decline in economic activity in the most important segment of the economy in the United States, the consumer economy, right? And why is that? Well, even during the Great Recession, things stayed open and people still went to restaurants and movies, shops, grocery stores, etc. They just went less because they had less money. Now, the majority of those businesses are shuttered. Unless you're designated an essential business, or unless you're in a state that didn't impose restrictions or where the restrictions are being lifted, you're mandated by law to shut. You can't be open, you can't do business. And this is going to fundamentally remake the economic landscape of the United States. 15% of American corporations had more debt than their annual revenues, right? So they were already underwater. They were already struggling to survive. When they see their sales completely crater, those businesses are not going to survive. And so on the one hand, a precipitous decline in economic activity. On the other hand, restructuring, world-altering effects on the economy that we don't yet fully understand. Another way to look at this is in terms of jobless claims. And I hope you can make sense of this, right? That those are the jobless claims during the Great Recession, right? These are the jobless claims at the beginning of March, right? And as I say, this data is not fully up to date, but I just think, again, this helps to put it in perspective. 22 million people losing their jobs, right? It's off the chart, right? So we've got upwards of 7 million people in a single week, whereas we've never had 1 million people before. Another way to put this, and I'll pull back, we're up to over 30 million people now. This is the diagram that didn't have the last week's information in it. That's the total labor force of more than 25 states. They're not the most populous states, but nevertheless, it's like half the country is out of work, if you think about it at the state level. Really, we haven't seen anything like this since the Great Depression. And as we know, the government's efforts to assist workers and businesses have been woefully inadequate. You hear these stories, and I know people who are in this situation, people who've been trying to get their unemployment claim filed for weeks, and the websites are crashing, the phones are busy, the offices are either closed or overwhelmed. And you understand why, right? We've never seen anything like this before. It's orders of magnitude different from what our infrastructure was designed to accommodate. And in addition to that, as you are probably aware, there's something called the Paycheck Protection Plan that the Small Business Administration is administering through the banks. And there have been two rounds of, they call it PPP, Payment Protection Plan, of assistance to businesses. The way this works is the assistance is the equivalent of 2.5 months of payroll for the employees that you employed in 2019, assuming you're still employing them in 2020. And if you continue to pay those employees, that amount that's given to you will be forgiven at the end of May. Or yeah, I think it's the middle of June, actually. Sorry, and so this is in a sense a really smart idea. Allow businesses to retain their employees even when they're closed down. But the way in which it's been administered, I think you have to refer to as really bungled. It's not gone to small businesses. There have been many delays. The banks have been overwhelmed. Many larger corporations have been able to cut to the front of the line and taken up much of the funds that were allocated. By the way, we're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars that's being allocated and is still inadequate to the situation we're in. So I just want to now begin to talk about the fact that what's happening in the economy is likely to exacerbate our inequality, right? And so I've already suggested to you that the coronavirus is attacking the fault lines that inequality has opened up in our society, that our society has become much more unequal, and that we are not moving in the right direction. Quite to the contrary, we're moving in the opposite direction. What is the coronavirus going to do, not just to the economy as a whole, but to inequality within the economy? And here, as you can see, that the jobs that are most vulnerable to layoffs as a result of the pandemic are concentrated at the bottom end of the wage scale, right? So food and beverage services, 10 to 12 million jobs are likely to be lost. They're almost all low wage jobs. And then you can go through clothing and retail, support and accommodation services. In automobile services, some high wage jobs are going to be lost. But as you get up the scale, fewer and fewer jobs are going to be lost for people who are in higher wage sectors of the economy. Please note that a low-income job here means less than essentially $800 a week, so less than $40,000 a year. And part of what you see when we look at who isn't working, right? And you can see in terms of the loss of jobs, right? that the people who are losing their jobs are dominantly, right, the people who are making $20,000 a year or less. The big job loss in the, $20,000 a year loss, significant job losses, $20,000 to $39,000 a year, huge job losses. And as you go further up the scale, fewer job losses. And as you know, I teach at Sarah Lawrence College. We've just announced that we will be furloughing a number of workers. Of course, it's not going to be the faculty. It's going to be the food service workers. It's going to be the people who clean the bathrooms, etc. We are not open. We don't need those workers right now. But again, it's going to be the workers at the bottom of the income scale that are going to be hit hardest by this. Their already precarious situation is going to be made still worse by what's going on in the economy right now. Let me add, and I'll come back to the data in a moment, but let me talk to you directly for a moment, that one of the things that people who study automation point out is that automation right now, the ability to use a robot to assemble an automobile, or the ability to use a computer kiosk to check in at a hotel or to order your meal at a McDonald's, has not been fully deployed. Quite to the contrary, there's a lot of technological possibility that has not yet been developed. And the prediction, when you read this literature, this was pre-COVID-19 literature, is that during the next major recession, there would be a great deal more automation because at that point, companies will try to shed their workers and replace them with long-term, less expensive automation options. You add to that the fact that we're now dealing with a pandemic, the trajectory of which is uncertain, but there's a good likelihood that it's going to be a recurring health problem for years. I'm sorry to say that, but that is at least based on what I see. Doesn't mean we're going to be sheltering in place 12 months a year for years, but it does mean that people describe it as shark tooth, that it's going to go up and it's going to go down. And we don't know exactly when it's going to start going up again. When it does, we're going to have to withdraw from economic activity again, start engaging in social distancing again. And so from a corporate point of view, it's probably a lot better to have a computer kiosk than a person, right? The computer kiosk, as long as you sterilize the keyboard, is not going to transmit the virus. The person may be asymptomatic but contagious. And so part of what I'm pointing out to you is that it's likely that there will be further automation, and that will further exacerbate inequality. How are incomes likely to change in the short term as a result of the coronavirus? And what you can see is that people making $25,000 a year or less may see their incomes go down by as much as 50% in the United States, right? So these are the most vulnerable among us, the least well off among us. And as you can see, they're going to have the highest decrease in their wages. People making $35,000 a year or less are all directly in harm's way. You can see that even people making $50,000, $55,000 a year may see their incomes go down 35% based on these projections of what the coronavirus is going to do to us in the short term. In the United States, jobs will be lost, and I've shown you one version of this already. substantially in the areas where people make less than $50,000 a year. And as you can see, the hardest hit people are going to be in the under $30,000 a year category. Then it's going to go down, and then it's going to go back up. There's going to be a substantial portion of the upper middle class who may also lose their jobs as a result of this. And please note, we're talking about a 15% increase in unemployment. That's a huge increase, really an unprecedented increase in unemployment. I want to return to a diagram I've shown to you before, but think about it in a slightly different way. What this diagram shows you is that in the United States, most people get their health insurance, their unemployment insurance, their retirement income through a private employer, right? Through private spending. When it comes to public spending, we're not awful, but we're down around number 10. And that directly reflects the fact that as a society, we ask private employers to do a lot of the stuff that in other societies, the government does. And so when those people lose their jobs, right, they're going to lose their health insurance. They're going to lose their retirement income. And so they're going to be additional compounding effects that will further exacerbate inequality in the United States. All right, why don't I take a break for a moment and see if any of you have any questions at this point about either the review from last week or the new material I've introduced about the economic impacts of the virus. I unmuted everyone, so now you're going to start hearing everyone. Who wants to ask the first question?
I do.
Who is this?
This is Harriet.
Hi, Harriet.
Hi. When I was growing up, and I knew, and all the people around me were growing up, it was my world, we were of the middle class. And you heard middle class so often. You would hear upper middle, perhaps, you'd hear lower middle. But now you don't hear about the middle class anymore. Do you think the middle class will ever come to the fore again?
Okay, so that's a great question, Harriet. Thank you. And what I want to say is you are absolutely right. And the literature on this refers to this as the hollowing out of the middle class. And so we can be precise about who the middle class is. Economists measure this in different ways, but you could take the median income in your society, the midway point, and you can go 50% below it and 50% above it, right? And so even in the post-war period, it was the case that around 60% of Americans, maybe 2/3, were middle class. It was not quite as much of our society as we like to think. And let's remember, you know, that in terms of race, we were very unequal in this period. And so it wasn't a paradise, but we were a dominantly middle-class society. Today, you use the same metric and fewer than 40% of Americans are middle class, and this virus is going to make that a lot worse, right? And so yes, you're absolutely right, Harriet. We are not as much of a middle-class society as we used to be, and it's going to get worse before it gets better. Can it get better? I'm absolutely convinced that it can. But in order for it to get better, we have to do two things at once. On the one hand, we have to fix our house domestically. We have to change tax policy. We have to change unionization policy. We have to be smart about worker training. We may also need to start reconciling ourselves to the idea that we no longer live in an economy where everyone who wants one can get a job. And either we're going to have to create a right to get a job, a new deal, And obviously there's talk of a Green New Deal, a New Deal that focuses on environmental policies as well. Or else we may have to have some sort of policy like universal basic income, which says that everybody who is in this society deserves a basic income, a minimally adequate income, and to no longer make your income depend exclusively on work. Maybe we'll have to renegotiate the social contract and think about other forms of social contribution. So that would be on the domestic front. And by the way, later in this lecture series, I will be giving a whole lecture on the policy possibilities here. I just want to kind of preview for you the idea that there are real and important policy opportunities to strengthen the middle class. In addition to that, I would say that there's an extremely important international dimension to this. And I just want to go back for a second to point out to you what I was showing you, and it's going to take me a moment to get there, about what's been happening with globalization, right? I'm sorry, I wish I could do this more efficiently, but there we go. That import competition has been decreasing wages, right? And unless we also address the international dimension to inequality, we aren't going to be able to do this successfully on our own. And so yes, there are things we could be doing, but it's not just we, the United States. It has to be, in addition to the United States, a more global effort. All right, Harriet, that was a good question. Thank you. Anybody else have a question?
Yeah, isn't it a possibility that the upper income people will begin to run the country, basically? I mean, they're the ones with all the money, and they're the ones that could really have the effect on whatever happens in this country. And they'll also get benefits from the government because they'll be buying the papers.
Stop talking.
What is the noise there?
All right, sorry about that. Obviously, we're used to it being muted, and there were some people making noise in the background. But we got Howard's question, and it's a very good question. What does this level of inequality do to democracy in the United States? And I will point out to you that one of actually the most influential article in political science published in the last 5 years used a simple metric, and I'm going to share this with you later. Do politicians listen to what the bottom 90% want them to do? Do they listen to what the top 10% want them to do? And it found that they really don't listen to what the bottom 90% want. They really only listen to what the top 10% and what lobbyists want. And they concluded, we don't live in a democracy. We live in an oligarchy, or what's sometimes called a plutocracy, the rule of the rich, the rule of the people who have taken most of the resources. Now, I think that in a sense, we need to be a little bit more complicated and nuanced about this. And obviously, we still have free elections on a regular basis, and many people are angry about this, and many people are venting their anger through their political choices, right? And on the other hand, I think it's absolutely clear. One of the big rubrics I'm going to use for thinking about inequality in future lectures is health. Is inequality healthy for us as individuals, the level of inequality that we have right now? Is it healthy for us as a society? Is it healthy for us as a democracy? And I think that you can show quite conclusively that the answer to all three of those questions is no. So yes, Howard, I think you are absolutely right to fear that in a democracy, we have to be equal as citizens. If we are so unequal as owners of wealth and earners, doesn't that undermine our political equality? The evidence is quite clear that it does. So yes, absolutely. All right, I'm about to unmute us to see if there's another question. Let's please try to keep the background noise down a little bit. Anybody else want to ask a question at this point?
Ann Friedman, I do want to make a comment.
Hi, Ann.
Hi, when I was trying to get you on the phone here, I had the television on. I was watching the Roosevelts, and it just came by coincidence. It came to the time when the Depression hit, and Roosevelt had to step in and change the whole structure of the economy and the whole structure of our way of thinking. And I think this is what we have to do. We have to get back to basics and start from scratch.
Perfect, Ann. Thank you. And you'll note that when I refer to one of the possibilities for us, a new New Deal, a Green New Deal, we're talking about things that are modeled on what Franklin Delano Roosevelt eventually implemented in the 1930s, which resulted in the decline in equality, the growth of equality in the United States in the post-war period. And so, yes, we need to be thinking about whether or not the level of inequality in our society is fair. If it isn't fair, if it isn't just, if it isn't sustainable, if it isn't healthy, what can we do about it? And you know, there's a saying attributed to Rahm Emanuel, the chief of staff of Barack Obama, that you should never let a crisis go to waste, right? And I do think there's a sense in which we are learning from having to respond to the coronavirus. And part of what we are learning is about the capacity for collective action, right? The coronavirus, it appears, and the data are still coming in, but it appears it's certainly going to be much less bad than many of the worst case scenarios that epidemiologists and people who model diseases were predicting a couple months ago, right? You know, our deaths will probably not be much greater in the first wave than 100,000. The initial projections were 250,000 to 1 million, right? And so we have made this a lot less bad than it could have been. And we've done it by being good. We've done it by staying home, by wearing masks, by engaging in social distancing, not via some governmental policy, right? The government has asked us to do those things, but we have to be the ones who do it. And I don't know. Again, I have no crystal ball more than anybody else, but it does seem to me that one possible outcome of all this, you add the fact that we've suffered this tremendous trauma with the degree of inequality that we have, that we've succeeded in certain respects in coming together, in part by staying apart, to solve this. Maybe we are entering a period in which we're going to expand the possibilities that are open to us politically. I certainly hope that that's the case, because obviously in terms of our political climate, this is not the 1930s or early 1940s. We are not as unified as a country. All right. Anybody else want to ask a question at this juncture? All right, then I'm not hearing anybody.
Professor? Oh, okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
I just want to say, so actually Franklin D. Roosevelt had a lot to do perhaps with the creation of the middle class, which lasted over many years.
Absolutely. And is this Susan? Am I recognizing your voice?
Harriet, yes.
That's Harriet.
Oh, that's Harriet. Okay. Sorry, I can't see who it is that's speaking. It sounded like it might have been speaking. Okay, Harriet. So absolutely right. And so we can think about the kinds of policies, right, that Franklin Delano Roosevelt implemented, whether it was allowing for a right to unionization or minimum wage or Social Security, eventually policies that allowed enlisted men to gain access to home ownership, the GI Bill, right? There were a whole bunch of policies that Roosevelt took a look at our economy and said, this can be better, this can be different. And in his famous speech on the freedoms, right, the 4 freedoms, he specifically articulated the idea that we have not only the civil and political liberties that our Constitution gives us, but also certain social rights. And then he sought to enact policies that made those rights concrete. So yes, the question is whether we can do that again in the 21st century. I think the need to do it is becoming increasingly clear based on the current situation we're in. All right, so I'm gonna unmute everybody one more time. Any more questions or comments, or should I push on with the lecture?
No, I have a comment, David.
Go ahead, Ann.
Yeah, do you recognize anybody in our political situation that would be able to do the thing, to take the leadership, to start this ball rolling?
Let me put it to you this way. I think if you looked at FDR in 1928 and you said to yourself, is this man going to completely restructure the American economy? You would not have said yes. You would not have been able to predict. I don't know who the person is, and I would say it's really hard to anticipate in advance. We can say who it probably isn't based on past experience. You know, I'm inclined to think there'll have to be a change in the White House for this to occur. And then the question will be, if there is a new occupant in the White House, will they embrace an ambitious agenda of bolstering the middle class, diminishing inequality in our society? And if they do, will they be able to effectively enact it, right? And so, you know, one of the things that FDR had was, in addition to really the worst economic crisis the country has experienced, a stranglehold on the other institution of legislation in our society, the Congress, right? The Democrats had unassailable majorities in the House of Representatives and the Senate. And when the Supreme Court obstructed FDR's New Deal, they won even larger majorities, right? And the Supreme Court, in their switch-in time that saved 9, changed their policies, right? And so yes, FDR was able to do this in part because he rose to the occasion. I don't think we can tell right now whether, let's say it's going to be Joe Biden will rise to the occasion or not. We'll have to wait and see on that. But even if he does try to rise to the occasion, will Congress allow him to? And that will depend, again, in part on the outcome of the 2020 election, in part on whether or not the experience of the coronavirus changes the fractiousness of the political climate in the United States, and allows us to have maybe a little bit more commonality of purpose. All right, I am going to get back to the lecture for the few minutes I've got remaining. And so I'm going to start now thinking less about the American economy and more about the global economy. And I'm going to point out to you that we don't have enough data to know for sure how the global economy is doing, but I think we should be worried. And of course, the United States has integrated into the global economy And so if the global economy is suffering, that will also redound to the disadvantage of the United States. And so one thing you can see here when you look at the price of oil is that the price of oil is really lower than it was. And you may have seen that it went negative because the supply of oil exceeded the capacity of the producers to actually store it. It's lower than it was at the nadir of the Great Recession. And that's a strong indication that the global economy is in trouble because oil is used to fuel planes and ships and trucks, the infrastructure of transportation that moves the goods around the globe. We can also look at what's happening in the second largest economy in the world. The US has the largest economy in the world, and obviously our economy is in deep trouble. The Chinese have the second largest economy in the world, and you may have seen in the first quarter of 2020, they broke a very long streak of consecutive quarters of economic growth that goes back nearly 40 years. And look at what's happened to car sales in China, nearly down 90% in February. And there's some signs that the virus is again coming back in Wuhan. And so China is certainly not out of the woods yet. If you look again at industrial production in China, after months and months of robust growth, it's way down in the first 2 months of 2020. Now, I want to not just look at countries. I want to look at the global economy as a whole. And one of the questions I want to raise is whether we are perhaps going to witness in the aftermath of the coronavirus or during its continued economic impacts. Two things. The first is an exposure of our underlying fragility, our underlying risks and dangers. And so I've already shared with you the idea that 15% of the companies now traded in US stock markets have more debt than they have annual revenues, right? That's a serious structural weakness that the coronavirus is going to expose in those companies. But there are other kinds of fragilities built into the global economy that have to do with what are called supply chains. And I'm going to take a simple example to illustrate this for you. This is a Boeing jet, right? And obviously Boeing has had a lot of trouble recently, but just to take it as an illustration, I want you to see where the components that make up a Boeing jet are made, right? And so you've got a wing that's made in part in Korea, in part in Japan, in part in Tulsa, Oklahoma. You've got back stabilizers and rudders that are made in China and Italy and Utah, right? You've got other components that are made in Japan and England, in Wichita and Sweden and Canada and the United Kingdom, right? The major products in the global economy are made all over the world. And I'm not going to ask you to fully understand the following diagram, but let me start with the Boeing plane, right? So you take this wing, which is made in Japan and Korea and Oklahoma. Do you think every component of that wing is made in Japan and Korea and Oklahoma? Do you think the metal and the plastic and the screws and the nuts and the solder and the glue and the insulation are made only in those countries? And the short answer to that is absolutely not, right? The ore is mined in Africa. It is processed in Latin America. The catalytic agents necessary to harden the steel may come from Asia, right? And so this then gets us to, and I know this diagram is not going to make a great deal of sense, but this is looking at Amazon, right? A slightly different way to look at supply chains. And this is looking at all the different countries that Amazon relies on in the first level. So when you buy something from Amazon, right, a large portion of what you buy comes from the United States, but a significant portion comes from the United Kingdom, from China, from Canada, from Japan, right? But then if you look at the second level, the people who sell you stuff on Amazon, where do they buy their stuff from, right? The United States, Japan, China, India, Taiwan, South Korea, and we could even go out to a third level. And so when we look at the plane, we need to not just look at the first level, where did each of those parts come from, but the second level and the third level. And what this reveals is that supply chains in the modern integrated global economy have two characteristics that render them fragile. One of them is that they are dispersed. They go all over the world. And the second thing is that they are long, right? The components may be put together in one country, but the components of the components come from another country, and the raw materials that that component of another component is made out of come from 6 or 7 other countries. And if the virus spreads unevenly to all of those countries, you may see Japan recover, but Korea or England or Italy still be in the grips of the virus. And so Boeing can't build the plane because it has what it needs from Japan, but not what it needs from Italy or Korea. And if it then spreads to Latin America or Africa, the stuff that the people in Korea or Italy or Japan need to make what they're making may be interrupted. And so the fragility of the global economy is reflected in those dispersed and long supply chains and the way in which they can be interrupted by a virus, right? And so I do think one of the things that we may be seeing, and in a sense, this is a development that predates the coronavirus. There was already a trade war going on between the United States and China. You remember the tariffs, you remember the increase in prices on certain raw materials as a result, the worry that companies were relocating from China to other places to avoid the tariffs. This was going on before the coronavirus hit us. But the coronavirus is exposing the degree of fragility that comes with a highly integrated global economy. And certainly, I think many developed societies are going to start reconsidering whether they are wise to rely on that degree of integration. Should our face masks come exclusively from manufacturing facilities in China? If China, as it has, puts brakes on the ability of countries like the United States to import face masks, does that represent a public health and national security risk to the United States? If we don't make any of our ventilators in this country, if we don't make critical drug and pharmaceutical supplies in this country, are we not rendering ourselves vulnerable? And on the other hand, and this is, let me see if I've got the diagram. I'll just show you this for a minute. There are in a sense two ways to think about the degree of vulnerability or two dimensions of vulnerability to disruption of supply chains. One of them concerns how many alternative sources are there? So if you're relying on Japan right now for that wing, but Holland can make it 2, and so can Italy, and so can the United States, right? You've got 6 alternative sources, then you're in pretty good shape. But if there aren't any alternative sources, or if there are only 2 alternative sources, your risk is higher that your supply chain will be disrupted. The other question is your inventory high or low of the supplies you need, right? And I've noted to you before, we have what's sometimes called a just-in-time economy, right? That's to say, rather than storing a whole bunch of stuff, corporations have decided it's cheaper and the technology allows them to just order the number of specific components they need and have them arrive just when they want to assemble them, right? And so the result is that many industries don't have many days of supply. If you've got 0 to 10 days supply, 10 days from now, if one of these other countries doesn't ship you more, you've got to shut down your operation, right? If you got 30 or 40 days of supply, you're in better shape, right? And so you can see that high tech is and very high risk, right? Interestingly, retail and apparel are at considerable risk. Pharma, right, where we get our drugs and medicines from, are also at quite substantial risk for international disruption. This is the last thing I want to show you today. And this is a diagram we've seen several times before. And this has to do with the costs of goods to consumers in the United States and what's happened to them over the last 20 years. And what you can see is the goods listed in blue, light blue, dark blue, have become more affordable. The goods listed in red have become more expensive. The reason that cars and clothing and furniture and phones and toys and computers and televisions have become more affordable is precisely because they've been globalized, because their components are made all over the world, wherever it's cheapest to make them, right? If we suffer a partial deglobalization, disintegration of the economy, if we start saying, we got to make more of that stuff here, it's just too risky in the time of a global pandemic to continue making stuff all over the world and relying on the fact that every country around the world is going to be able to get it to us when we need it, this stuff is going to become more expensive. And I would point out to you, when we combine this diagram with what we know about what's been happening with income and wages and wealth, part of the reason that Americans are not worse off than they are already is because the costs of so many goods that we consume have come down as opposed to going up, right? This has contained inflation, sustained the standard of living despite stagnant wages over the last 20 years. If we do suffer a partial disintegration of the global economy, we can expect those goods to come up in their prices. And again, this is another way in which the coronavirus then will exacerbate inequality. All right, so I'm gonna stop there for today. And again, I'm gonna unmute you and give you the opportunity to ask questions. Who would like to start us out?
Me.
Go ahead, hi.
I don't know how we ever got
Yeah,
into
hi Lois.
I don't know how we ever got into this mess. What this just how did this happen? Why what is this? I am really flawed by this. And when you say
all of it.
what? And it's more expensive to provide certain services, like those seem to be services that people provide rather than widgets. Is that a factor in why all those things are more expensive than? I don't know. I'm flawed by this. I really am.
All right, Lois, thank you. And this is, I know, stunning information to digest. And so I'll start with your narrow question, right? All the services that became more expensive, what they have in common, yes, is that people provide them, but you need to consume them in this country, right? You can't buy a house in China and stay in this country. You can't see your doctor in China and stay in this country. You can't send your kids to school in China and let them come home at night, right? So those are education, healthcare, housing, things that have to stay in this country for us to be able to consume them. And those are things that have become more expensive. But how did this happen? And I would point out to you that there was a concerted effort to facilitate globalization by consecutive presidents in the United States, not only Republicans, but Democrats as well, that there was an effort within industry to embrace new technology, automation, globalization, right? And there were efforts at the level of the states to counteract unions. There is the abysmal role of money in politics, which has created a climate in which it's harder and harder for people who are egalitarians to get their message heard or to win elections, right? And so there's more than enough blame to go around. We do need to understand what happened, right? What is it that's contributing to the level of inequality? How did it happen? It happened because of changes in our political culture, our climate ideology over the last 50 years. That's important too, but I think what's much more important to ask is, what can we do about it, right? And in a sense, I need to do more work with you to help us to understand exactly what's happened and why it is so dangerous to us that we've become so unequal. So I'm not quite there yet, but we will be getting to the question, what can we do as well? All right. Anybody else with the final question?
A last question. Hello, I have a question.
I can hear you. I can hear you.
At the time of Roosevelt, there were so many people out of jobs, the Depression, and he set them to work on the roads and all the infrastructure. Why can't we give jobs to people today to improve our roads and our bridges and all the infrastructure we talk about?
I think that was Harriet. That was another great question. And you know that the American Society of Engineers gives the infrastructure in the United States, depending on the survey, a D or an F, right? Our infrastructure is crumbling. And it's not just the old infrastructure, the roads and the bridges and the highways. It's also 21st century infrastructure. We need much more, for instance, electrical charging stations for electrical automobiles so that we can transition our transportation infrastructure into an infrastructure that is less likely to generate greenhouse gases and contribute to global warming. And we need higher speed internet than we already have if we're going to be globally competitive. We need to be doing with education what we did in the middle of the 20th century, increasing access to it and making our education system among the most progressive and leading in the world, right? And so there's just a whole bunch of stuff that you're absolutely right we need to be doing in terms of infrastructure. That means that we need to be spending on it. And I would point out to you that our tax base has gone down, right? It's very hard for government to continuously spend money that it doesn't have. And we just collect less taxes now than we did in the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s. Of course, part of Roosevelt's struggle with the Supreme Court was to get that tax base for the federal government. Part of the problem with globalization is that corporations and wealthy individuals will take their money elsewhere if the taxes go too high in a country. We've got to be able to address that problem as well. But yes, I think you're absolutely right that one thing we could be doing to stimulate the economy right now is not just dishing out money. That's the most immediate thing we can do. And I'm not saying we shouldn't be doing that, but also investing in things that are going to be good for our society in the long term. And infrastructure expenditure is one of the best of those options. All right, everybody, it was really great getting to see you today. And I will be back next Friday, and we will continue with this lecture series. Please take care. Please be understanding. I know this is an awful circumstance, that the degree of isolation, not being able to get out and enjoy a nice spring day is taking a toll on you. Please understand that it's for your health and for the good of our whole community. The alternative, frankly, is releasing ourselves from these restraints too early, and then we end up exposing ourselves to the virus or exposing ourselves to the next wave, and it's worse. It's not fun for any of us, but we do have to keep doing this. All right, everybody, be safe, be well, take care, and I will see you next week. Bye-bye.